This is Bring It In, TrueHoop's From Quarantine show. Thank you for joining us. David Thorpe is here, and Ari Caroline. How are you, Ari?
I'm doing well. Yeah, how
So
are you
we're
guys?
good, good. You and I are meeting sort of face to face for the first time, but I've been aware of your work forever because even though you are now a senior vice president of Tempus, a groundbreaking company using AI in medicine in ways I hope you can explain because I don't understand it. You started out basketball.
I don't know if well, I mean, technically that's true. I guess I did start out in basketball since, like the junior Jewish basketball league when I was a kid, that came before most of all this.
Right.
Yeah, no. I've been, a hoops nerd, stats geek for a long time. I studied financial economics in grad school, which is all statistics, and there's nothing better to apply. I ended up applying it to medicine, but also, figured could use it for MBA. So, yeah, I've been doing that for a while. Written for a few blogs, contributed to the Wins Produced and the Basketball Geeks for a while. And I think
Yeah,
that's how we connected.
I always noticed, I was like, oh, like one of, like, there was a collection of, I don't know, like 100 people who would write things about basketball at that time, 10 years ago or so, I guess. And I was like, oh, but one of them is the chief analytics officer at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, which seemed like a little bit different from your standard basketball blogger at that time.
For me, it all connects. There's something about it being the same math, the same type of statistics, the same type of mathematical programming. But the truth is just, yeah, I'm a nerd who gets into lots of different things and applies knowledge wherever I can.
We want to ask you about the NBA reopening and Disney, and we'll get to that in a minute. A lot of like questions germane to your expertise there. But first, you recently tweeted a little story about your dad, which seems very appropriate to the moment. Do you mind telling us that?
Yeah, it was actually prompted by a discussion at work. So I'd been mostly staying quiet on the personal side, retweeting a lot of other things that I saw that were meaningful for me. But we attended protests here in New Haven where we live, but didn't really make a lot of in terms of any personal statements. But I saw at work that there was a lot of back and forth about whether the company should make a statement or not, and I didn't want to comment in that regard, but I did want to. It made me realize that you really have to speak up. You have to share your story, and so I shared this story about my dad, which I think was a sort of foundational story for us as a family growing up, naturally so. So my dad had been something of a radical. There was, I think his nickname in the Texas newspapers was Caroline the Red when he was a professor at the University of Texas. But he was an activist as an undergrad at the University of Rochester. He became the president of the NAACP there. And then as a grad student at University of Michigan, we followed him there. My brother and I followed him. Both my parents did their PhDs at the University of Michigan. So he helped to found the Students for a Democratic Society, and then on a Woodrow Wilson a foundation, I don't remember exactly what it was, grant, he ended up teaching at one of the historical Black colleges and universities at Kentucky State University. And this was in '65, right before the Selma marches. And he very much wanted to be in Selma. The administration of Kentucky State did not think that it was good for one of their professors to be there, but he wanted to contribute in any way he could. So he was encouraging all the students to go, but they were limited in terms of transportation. So somebody had arranged for a flight for some of the students, and my father drove down from Kentucky State to Montgomery, Alabama, where the airport was, and basically as a chauffeur to ferry the students back and forth from the airport in Montgomery to Selma. And he made a bunch of trips, and at some point realized that he was being followed by the Alabama State Police. Obviously, he became pretty scared at that point. There had been enough stories for him to know that this was, not a safe situation. He had stopped at the airport, found a payphone, thought maybe he'd call the FBI. You know, it's a federal agency. Thought that they would be able to intervene. I think the way my father put it is the guy on the other end at the local office in Alabama said, "I'm sorry, sir, I cannot help you," and hung up the phone. Um, so my father kept on pushing along. Uh, and on the next run back, he was pulled over by the state patrolman. And at that point, you know, he wasn't sure what to expect. So hold on one second. I'm went into sleep mode. Make sure I can see you guys.
Oh yeah, you definitely want to see
We
us.
see you.
Yeah, we can see you.
All right, good.
You're
So
getting
the camera's
hacked.
still
I
down.
think. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see you guys again. All right. So the patrolman basically made it clear that, you know, it was just, he didn't like seeing, I don't know what his official language is, you know, he didn't had said there were enough N-word loving kikes in the world, and he picked up his revolver and he put it to my father's temple. And you know, my father thought pretty much that was it. But for whatever reason, I don't think we have any way of knowing this, but he didn't pull the trigger. My father made it back to the airport and got back to Kentucky State. But I think in a way, you know, like we grew up realizing how, you know, our entire family's existence, you know, our existence as kids only emerged because of that sort of what seems on the surface like an arbitrary decision by a person in power, a patrol, you know, an Alabama state policeman, not to pull the trigger. And I think, you know, when you're able to personalize things and understand how much that sort of capricious, you know, like decision of somebody, you know, to apply violence or not to apply violence can fundamentally transform your life. It certainly has created a natural sympathy, a natural, like, real passion for what we've been seeing in the news lately with George Floyd and, you know, Ahmaud Arbery and others. So
Your Twitter account is so like heavy right now, as is everybody's, I guess. But like maybe the next tweet was protesters walking by Memorial Sloan Kettering, healthcare workers out there cheering for them, and I was like, oh, like yeah, yeah, there you go, yeah, there you go.
yeah, so I needed to lift things up after that. You know, I'm really, you know, like, it's not easy for me to share personally, and you know, especially when it's you know, when it's an emotional type of thing on, you know, that you know, has some sad you know, certainly given everything that's going on, has some sad undertones to it. And so I wanted to lift things up a little bit. And I truly am a very proud alum of Memorial Sloan Kettering, and it was great to see that. You know, to see, you know, them cheering on the protesters cheering them on, and I feel immense pride in all of my friends and former colleagues at MSK who have been working through this.
That's your story you just told, and that little video we just saw is the coronavirus and George Floyd, like all just coming together in this sort of crazy way where it feels like everyone's under so much stress.
Yeah, totally.
Well, I like what he says just about how, Ari, when you wrote and talk about how none of you would be around living the lives you led, had that officer, you know, pulled his finger maybe 2 millimeters more if his finger was on the trigger, right? And just that moment of consequence, apply it to the current situation with Floyd, 2 inches different than 2 inches less of the knee to his neck. He's probably home with his family right now, and none of this has happened, and we're strictly focused on the virus. That tiny little difference has such huge consequences, and they're not always being considered. I'm sure the police officer who didn't shoot your dad, he probably thought at least somewhat of what might happen if he murders this person. We need that. I mean, as awful was as even pull the gun, at least he didn't pull the trigger. You know, we have to have all of those people empowered thinking about consequences. We're not getting enough of that.
Yeah, without question. I mean, in the George Floyd case, I mean, it wasn't, I don't know if it was just 2 inches. I mean, the guy went way, way beyond anything we ever want to see. But yeah, no, I mean, it's one individual, who is empowered by, our system, to make really profound decisions about other people's lives. And you have to question about whether we're putting enough thought into that system that gives people the right incentives to do the right thing when you have so much power.
We have so much we want to talk about. You also mentioned in passing that you were having a conversation with David Stern at the time of his passing about an interesting thing. Can you explain this to us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Hold on, I want to see if I have a way to make this so that it doesn't go into sleep quite as often.
Yeah, we're trying to wake people up, Ari.
All right, yeah, no, it's just the computer going to sleep mode. It's not me. I may look tired, but I'm good. Yeah, so it was several months before his passing, and I was at a VC event where I was speaking with a few others, and he was among the guests there. I don't know if he actually spoke, but he was among the guests. And I ended up sitting at the same table as him, and I started talking to him about the subject that was front of mind for me right then, which is market mechanisms. And the reason it was is because I was in the middle of writing a book with a co-author, which we haven't finished yet because of other things that developed.
What good
About
you doing? I understand.
right, yeah. About how market mechanisms can be used to transform healthcare. And I started to, spin some ideas about how some of the ideas of market mechanisms could be applied in the MBA as well. And he kind of liked, a lot of the ideas. And he asked me to write it up and send it to him. And unfortunately, before I had a chance to actually fulfill my promise to do that, we got the news that he passed away. So we'll have to find some other way.
Can you give us a little synopsis of like, this is draft salary cap? Like how does this apply, this idea of yours?
Yeah, absolutely. So in some ways it works better if we discuss, really get into what market mechanisms are and how they work overall. There's a fantastic podcast that Planet Money did about feeding America. My daughter is very active now, working with people who have become homeless as part of her social activism in college, and she's at Harvard. And Cambridge has a big homeless problem, and she's volunteers in the shelter there, and she's been doing a lot there. But it'll connect when we talk about the MBA reopening. But the Feeding America podcast was discussing an issue that they had. So Feeding America is a centralized group that provides a lot of the food pantries, the local food pantries throughout the country with food. So if a big corporation has produced, or a farm has produced too much of something that they can't sell, something's close to the expiration date, they'll get this huge shipment of whatever it is, canned beans, bread, cereal, right? And they'll find ways to distribute it to all of these different food pantries. But it turns out it's a really inefficient centralized system. So, people were, getting on a list and saying, we want to be next on the list. And whatever came up next, if it was 1,000 pounds of potatoes, that's what you got. And it didn't matter if you were a food pantry in Idaho and you had all the potatoes you ever needed, that was the next thing on the list, right? And different types of foods for different locales, different quantities were valuable for different types of groups. And so they went to the University of Chicago economics department and asked a couple of the professors there to help them figure this out. It's interesting that I don't know how they ended up, with the Milton Friedman School of Economics, for a food pantry. But they came up with this idea that was brilliant of applying what's called a market mechanism. And people hear this and they say, well, okay, that's capitalism. That doesn't apply here, right? We can't be capitalists. We're the altruistic socialists. But a market mechanism is not the same as capitalism, as raw capitalism. Market mechanism is recognizing that when you empower individuals to make individual decisions that are best for that local situation, that you actually get a much more efficient decision making. And so what they did was they created this fake currency where each individual food pantry could bid on what was available as it became available using this fake currency. And then each food pantry was able to allocate their currency, their resources, right, in a way that was efficient to get them what was actually useful for them.
I
And
love that.
so, yeah, so it was a way of applying what's this market mechanism in, you know, in a non-purely capitalist way. And so that it works in a lot of other situations as well, and could work in a lot of other situations. So I've always been frustrated by the NBA salary cap and, you know, the sort of random restrictions it makes in terms of, you know, trade allowances and all of the rules that are associated with, you know, having to match cap on trades if you're over the cap. There are issues associated with the rookie salary cap. Hold on one second, we're going to sleep again, sorry.
Okay, we need time to digest all the things you're saying.
Yeah, sorry. If I'm going too fast, please stop
No,
me.
please.
No, it's
please.
good.
We can always replay it.
All right. So it occurred to me that there was a lot that could be done by just applying some natural, you know, the NBA salary cap situation is one that's kind of, you know, anti-capitalist at its heart. It is a little bit of a trust, but, you know, there are ways in which you can apply, again, market mechanisms to make this work. And I was always bothered by it in terms of the draft as well, because, right, you have often at the top of the draft, you know, players that are so much more valuable than those lower down. You know, often it's the number one pick. It's someone like Zion, you know, Anthony Davis, that are just so clearly so much better than everyone else that, you know, just randomly somebody having that number one pick doesn't seem to be fair. You've had, you know, I was a big fan of the process in Philadelphia. I grew up in Philadelphia. And, you know, had been disheartened with the Sixers all the way from the days when they traded away Barkley. But, you know, once you know, things started to turn around and they started to bring in the geeks like me, people like Ben Falk and others, you know, I started to really get into it. But one of the big criticisms, of course, was, you know, the tanking, right? And they were gaming the system. And so the question was to me, like, how are you shaping incentives, right, that causes the teams to want to tank, and how might you do it better in some other way? And so if you think about it, the whole idea of the NBA draft, and particularly the lottery, is around, you know, trying to create this competitiveness, right? And so for teams that might be in you know, smaller markets, to allow them to compete. And so the proxy for that was, if you lose, right, then we want to make it more competitive. We want to give you a way to get better. But in truth, it's not, you don't want to reward losing. You just want to even things out for teams that don't have as much money. So think about this as, you know, the food pantries, right, that were disadvantaged, right? By giving them, you know, this fake currency, you could empower them. So what if instead we had this fake currency that was allotted for the NBA draft, right? And if you spend over a certain amount, you know, whatever we call a salary cap, we would allow for teams in any team that didn't spend over that amount, you know, there's something equivalent to the luxury tax where that's allocated in draft dollars for these other teams. And so then you can use that draft currency to make up for the fact that you can't afford the veterans, the veteran free agents. You can make up for that by having more draft currency, and then you could trade that draft currency, and you could use it proportionally based on the value of the player, right? So you still have maybe some draft order based on, you know, order of finish, and maybe the last one to bid is the team that actually has the pick. But if you've built up your draft dollars and you really want to put it all on that top player, then it actually reflects the value of the players a lot better and allocates those players a lot better based on the resources available to the teams.
Interesting. If you want to write more about that and publish it somewhere, I want to read the whole. I want to get into all the
All right, so we're committing it to TrueHoop.
Absolutely, 100%. Yes, there's a highway from your house to TrueHoop on this one for sure. Like, yeah, let's do it, 100%. Right. And it's too we can't talk about it now. I'm sorry, it's too interesting. It's gonna take us forever, and we have to talk about the coronavirus because people might die. So let's. Thank you for explaining that, though. I sent you a lot of thoughts. I interviewed a bunch of people last week about, how would you safely reopen and what would be the protocols and blah, blah, blah. Adam Silver identified 4 conditions he had his eye on in April: path to antivirals, path to a vaccine, a decrease in new positive test results, and I'm forgetting the one other one. What was it? I have it here. It's only 4 things I had to remember for the show.
Which were the 3 you just mentioned? So there's antivirals, vaccines, number of tests, and overall
availability of tests, and then a decrease in new cases.
Right.
Okay, Ari, go.
Okay, so actually, one more slight tangent, which is a disclosure. So it's very important in the healthcare world where I live, where I work, that before talking about giving over anything as an expert, that you give over any conflicts of interest. So disclose any conflicts of interest. You mentioned my history at Sloan Kettering, and unfortunately, one of the things that precipitated our decision to leave Sloan Kettering and start a new company was that MSK became a lot more risk averse after a series of articles in ProPublica. The initial one was about our amazing leader and physician-in-chief, Jose Baselga, who was really open to doing some revolutionary things and was really supportive of some of our efforts. But there had been several articles that he had not offered all of his disclosures in terms of conflict of interest and being on the board of a couple pharma companies. And it completely it led to his dismissal, a little unfortunately, and a cascade of events that went not well for Sloan Kettering and certainly not well for us. So hold on, getting out of sleep again. So my disclosure in this regard is wrong password. My disclosure in this regard is now I find myself working for a lab company that actually, this Tempus Labs bought out our startup just several months into the startup after we left Sloan Kettering. Tempus Labs is an incredible company that has now developed, recognized the need and developed tremendous capacity for PCR testing. Also, we'll be doing some serology testing. And so we're in the business now. And so my disclosure is I work for a company that actually provides this testing capacity and has created a lot of testing capacity. And so we'll keep that in mind, as a conflict of interest as I'm discussing this. But hopefully I can give you an objective.
If you recommend testing, I'll be like, oh, suspicious.
Right. I'm not on the sales side, so I don't get any commission. But I'm still going to do my best to be objective. Yeah. So I think of those conditions that Adam Silver set out, realistically speaking, testing is probably the only one in which we have made significant progress. Now, that's a little bit unfair in the sense that we have made tremendous progress in terms of vaccines and potential treatments. And I'm being careful as I say this, not just antivirals, because a lot of the treatments, certainly in the acute setting, that have been successful have been focused on the immune system and actually turning off an aggressive inflammatory response, what's called a cytokine storm, that the virus triggers. So there has been progress in terms of treatments. Those treatments are happening, and any studies that have shown really significant progress have been happening only in the acute setting. So it doesn't really help you, when you're talking about um, sort of an outpatient, non-acute setting like the MBA is talking about. Vaccines we've made progress on, but they're not going to be available. I think the Oxford vaccine, which is, partially functional based on the initial studies, they're going to have, the first 1,000,000 doses in September or October. So it's sooner than anybody could have imagined, but, not in time for the NBA's consideration. And in terms of incidence, the, obviously in New York City, it's gone down quite a bit. But in the rest of the country, it's pretty flat. And you think with everything going on now, and everybody, being back outside for good reason in this case, unfortunately, we probably are going to see something of a resurgence. So I don't think we've met criteria for those three criteria really at all in terms of consideration. I don't know if those were the necessary criteria, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the isolated setting that they've been imagining in Orlando, and how you can get around some of the considerations there. But the one thing that you really do need then is the testing, because you need constant information. Because I think as you mentioned in your questions that you sent to the NBA, right? If there's just one positive test, and that positive test implies that somebody has been sick already for a couple of days at least, right? And has had contact with a bunch of others, you have to stop everything. So now if you're talking about, redoing the entire playoffs, right? And, I don't know, the regular playoffs go from April into June, right? So, maybe there are a few ways that you could speed that up without risking injury to the players. You probably can, especially if you don't have them traveling, you have them all in the same place. But if you have to halt the series for a few days, that's going to throw off that calendar, horribly. So,
well, and there was a leaked comment that Commissioner Silver said, basically, we have to get used to the idea that we will have a positive test and keep going.
Yeah, but the thing is that if you have a positive test, it's not going to be a single positive test. The nature of the game, and I think one of the other questions you asked was, whether they were going to play the games outside. And I was thinking about outside games in Orlando in August. I'm like, no
chance.
No way.
I live here, no chance.
Yeah,
it had to be 7 a.m. or something, right?
Right. But even then, it's not humid.
Yeah, but then you lose your TV crowd. In any case, I don't think that's happening. I don't know if it would really make a difference. The players are so close together. They're breathing on each other. That's where it's the air droplets, the saliva that's going from one to the other, and I don't think you really make a huge difference in that regard by playing games outside. So
it's not going to happen anyway. It was mostly I'm trying to flush out, like, what are you thinking, or how are you analyzing this? Like, anyway, go ahead. But it's not happening for sure.
Yeah. So what I was trying to say is that if you have one player that tests positive, it's not going to be one player that tests positive. Right? You're going to have several players from that series that are all going to test positive together, and that does stop things. The margin for error here is just tiny, right? Now, a lot of those players could be asymptomatic, could theoretically continue to play. And maybe then you have a break between the series that gives you a little bit of margin for error, but it's not a huge margin for error that you have. And so the notion of creating this bubble in Orlando where they were completely isolated, that they're quarantined for a few weeks beforehand, that you control everybody who goes in and everybody who goes out, struck me as really the only way that the NBA would have any chance of achieving this. And I think even then, not enough, because you're going to have some mistakes. Somebody's going to come in, and if there's a resurgence in cases, it's going to find its way into the bubble. It's not going to be a perfect hermetically sealed bubble. So it prompted some thinking in terms of what else the NBA might do. So from an epidemiology perspective, the common model that's used is called the SIR model. It's susceptibility, the susceptible population, the infected population, the recovered population, and you can model how incidence is likely to occur based on those three, the relative proportion of those three populations. And so I was thinking about how you could lower the percentage of the susceptible. So in some ways, we could do some serology testing, look at the antibodies, although antibodies are not a perfect measure of immunity in this case, in both directions. We can talk about that if you want. But you could determine ahead of time who actually is susceptible, right? Who has antibodies, who is less likely to be susceptible. But you could also take some other steps. So, and this, gets to some sort of the opportunities of creating this, incredible experiment of this bubble with a few thousand people in it together, right? There are several vaccines that are already in human trials, right? Maybe the NBA works with one of these vaccine makers, like Moderna, that seems very, that has a vaccine that seems very promising. And you say, we want to be part of your study. And even if it's a randomized study, meaning 50% of the people aren't getting the actual vaccine, right? You're still potentially reducing your susceptible population by quite a bit. And there are a lot of experiments like that you could do with vaccines, testing, and I think on the social side also, and that's what I was referencing, in terms of the passion for social causes, and I think connecting this with everything that's going on with our society. So my daughter, who I mentioned before, was promoting the idea, like, you have all of this extra housing in Orlando that's not going to be used, right? And that's part of the advantage of having a location like that. What if you put into quarantine ahead of time with all of the NBA players and the staff and the support staff for the parks and the hotels and the catering, et cetera, which is great for the community there and gives a lot of people their jobs. And so it's good in and of itself, right? It's capitalism working. But what if you added a social bent to it as well, and provided housing for a lot of the newly homeless, people who have become, lost their jobs because of the COVID crisis. We know that homelessness disproportionately affects, the African American community. Make a statement and say, okay, we're not just taking these elite NBA players and those associated with them, but we're also going to provide housing for 5,000 newly homeless people associated with COVID, and they're going to take part in this process with us. We're going to provide the same testing to them. They're going to be part of the whole thing. So I think there's an opportunity here for the NBA, for the Disney company, to do something that's really, really different, both on the medical side, on the social side, and I think it's a rare opportunity that shouldn't be missed.
Ari, I love that you're saying this, and I've been thinking of it as like, okay, America didn't do a great job with our response. We're not South Korea, right? And I was like, maybe my brain is tempted to imagine, like, maybe we can have a
microcosm how to do it right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
maybe there's
absolutely.
a place in America that can do it right, and I'm hopeful that the NBA has a lot of resources and a lot of they will make $1 billion+ from this experiment, so they can pay for some things to happen, right? And
I think it's also something that they probably want to do, that the players want to do. It's a great story to tell. I think it makes it so much more compelling in terms of like following the playoffs and seeing how the players connect maybe with some of these homeless families. Seeing how you could actually create a model for actually reducing incidence rate, even in a concentrated setting like NBA basketball games.
It would be amazing. I love what you're describing. I have this like crushing conviction, just having spoken to a lot of people involved recently, that like no chance, like no chance it'll even be a priority to be that model, right? Like, it seems to me like they just want to get the games on the TV. Like, it just seems like that's it.
Yeah, but the thing is that first of all, I think this is compelling TV. You know, if you think about it in terms of like what people like to watch and
Yeah.
for, you know, true life TV, right? Um, but the thing is that I think they have to be innovative in order to make this work. From you know, from an epidemiology perspective, from a medical perspective, there's so little margin for error that they have to be innovative in order for this to work. They have to have constant testing, and they have to have some strategy for reducing the susceptible population, because there will be somebody infected who gets in, even with your perfect bubble, your imperfect bubble, um, and you know, and however many weeks, you know, you have people isolated beforehand.
I
I
think
can't stop thinking about Jurassic Park, where they try to control nature. And
It's
Malcolm
actually a
kept
very good
saying,
analogy.
that's what I'm really afraid of, is chaos is coming. We're trying to control nature. They were trying to control dinosaurs. We're trying to control a virus and the impacts of it. I have a lot of fear for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said for recognizing that you can't control it completely. You do your best to control it, but what steps can you take then to minimize the impact, recognizing that there will be, you know, that mistakes will happen.
I keep thinking about the New York Times had a story a couple weeks ago about these like geneticists were looking at the hotspots across the U.S. and where the virus came from, and maybe not all of them, but the disproportionate number were basically New Yorkers, right? New Yorkers went to Mardi Gras, New Yorkers went to Texas, New Yorkers went
Miami.
Miami,
Yeah.
and and I'm thinking about okay,
When
so
they did the genetic tracing of you know, when they were looking at the different viral strains. And
correct.
just as a caution here, people hear viral strains and they think that means that makes a big difference in terms of potential immunity or whether a response to treatment. Here, it's just talking about different viral strains in terms of being able to track the genetic lineage.
Right. So then there was a little map that came with that story, and it was like, oh, like basically, as someone who lives right outside of New York, as do you, I was like, sorry, world, sorry, we didn't stay home, bummer. But now I'm thinking about, you know, one of the published estimates is 3,500 people will be inside this bubble, like a tremendous number of whom live near you and me, Ari, right? Like
only 3,500? How could it only be 3,500? Because you know, I don't know. You think about each team, you know, each team with all of their staff, and then you need all of the support people, right? Who are, you know, making sure that everything runs. You know, you have the television crew. You know, I was my best guess was going to be closer to around 15,000 people.
Wow.
Whoa. Okay, so whatever the number
By
is.
the way, you know what the capacity that Disney has in Orlando is sufficient for that.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, if it's all going to be NBA, but they're opening. Disney's already published their schedule. They're opening to customers. So like NBA's only gets a little chunk.
Okay, so that throws out the whole thing. How do you stay hermetically sealed then? I mean,
they're going to be in one part of Disney. Disney's multiple parks, right? So they're going to be on the Disney property.
Got it.
But so my point is, though, these are plane loads of people. Like, so my point is, are we about to replicate when New York gave hotspots to the nation again? And is David's local hospital in Florida about to be burdened by what the NBA is about to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think there's a super high risk. So obviously, you know, the death rate that we saw in New York was related with the, you know, the overwhelmed healthcare system. So there were so many cases that happened all at once, and the healthcare system was not prepared for it. And a lot of people died who shouldn't have died. And you obviously don't want to replicate that. On the other hand, you know, like where you look in Germany, where they have done a much better job than other European countries of controlling cases, they have as much incidence as they have in other places. But they have much lower incidence among the high-risk population, the older population. They've done a very good job of keeping the older population isolated. And so I think, you know, in this case, this particular experiment with the NBA, it's far less likely, given the relatively younger population, that you're going to have an overwhelming number of acute cases that are, well, you know, in the large part are the older people with this disease.
Right. Coaches, management, trainers, doctors.
Right.
They're more at risk.
There are a lot of them. There are a lot of them at risk.
Yeah.
I think that speaks to, like who you have there, and maybe, some of the people shouldn't go if they're in those high risk categories. But that's just speaking toward, the healthcare system overall not being overwhelmed. But, even if just one person, God forbid, one person died from this, let's say, God forbid, it was Pop. Like, so would we say, okay, we're willing to sacrifice George Popovich, for this? It's, even if you don't have a huge outbreak and, overwhelming the hospitals, even if it's not something as bad as that, there are going to be cases of people getting sick, and if there are people who are vulnerable, there could be fatalities as well. So it's worth thinking about. I think the way you control that is, taking Germany's approach and saying that, for certain high risk categories, which is going to include some of the head coaches, and I think you have to go through the list. Assuming that they're going to go with the existing playoff teams, I guess the Spurs wouldn't be in it, but there are definitely some head coaches that would be in that high risk category.
And would you make a policy of, like, if you're over a certain age, you just don't come in the bubble?
Yeah, honestly, yeah.
That's what I was going to
What would
ask.
that age be?
Yeah, that's definitely an asterisk for the games, right? If you have a head coach, if a team has to play without their head coach.
Better than dying.
Yeah. He asked what age. I want to hear what you say, Ari. Henry asked, what age might you do that? Please say older than 55.
Yes. So 55 would be probably the safest cutoff. Probably, a more realistic cutoff is 60 or 65. But the risk grows exponentially as you get older, right? So the risk for those over 65 is much greater for those over 55.
And then what about, like, Larry Nance Jr. has talked openly about his Crohn's disease, and he takes, he's like immunocompromised by the therapy for that, right?
So it's interesting. So one of the, I actually should have mentioned this in terms of my history when we opened up here. One of the reasons that I've had to learn so much about this disease is because when there was the first outbreak in early March, so my family had isolated because there had been an engineer in our New York office who ended up testing positive. He was in that New Rochelle community where the outbreak first occurred. And so we thought we were protecting our community by going into quarantine. We were in quarantine the week that the outbreak happened in our community in New Haven. And it was horrible. I mean, just it was the week of the holiday of Purim. People were getting together, in their homes, even though we had canceled a lot of the synagogue activities. And the vast majority of the community got it. Thank God we were able to intervene really early, in terms of the synagogue activities, isolating a lot of the older community, taking a lot of, learning from the strategies that were working in Europe. And thank God, we got through it. Nobody passed away, but that we had, I was tracking everybody's symptoms because our family had been okay. My boss, Eric Lefkowski, who founded Tempus, said, Ari, please go take care of your community. He gave me 2.5 weeks off, and I did nothing but that. And we were tracking everybody's symptoms. And among those, I created this Google form. Everybody was reporting on their symptoms. Among those, there were several people with Crohn's and other autoimmune type conditions. And there were a lot of questions that were going on. It's not an easy answer, but because what we're actually seeing is that the really severe cases are coming from an overactive immune response, right? The cytokine storm that I was referring to before. In many cases, a lot of the immune suppressing drugs that people with autoimmune conditions take are the most effective in controlling that immune response, and that actually could be helpful. So one of the drugs that we helped to get a protocol in place at Yale that Dr. Naftali Kaminsky led at Yale, but we as a community helped to push that initial study, was using the drug that's probably been most effective in the acute setting, which is called tocilizumab. Tocilizumab is it's called an IL-6 antagonist, which basically stops this immune response. It's used for rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune condition. And what it does is it slows down that immune response. And it's been one of the most effective drugs in the acute setting. So yeah, somebody with Crohn's, somebody with an autoimmune condition might be naturally at higher risk, but a lot of the drugs that they would be taking actually lower their risk significantly. Somebody with Crohn's typically would also be taking, something equivalent to an aspirin, which actually has which is also an anticoagulant. So they often take more expensive drugs that are like a slow release version of an aspirin. And a lot of the acute conditions have also been associated with clotting. And so there are some creative things that you could do, and actually might make sense for them to do across all players and all teams, for having all of them taking some dose of aspirin, relatively high dose of aspirin throughout. That could make it so that you're far less likely to have any of the acute cases that are associated with the clotting.
Bilal is in the chat, who is a doctor in England, was asking if you think the age should be determined by ethnicity, and now it gets tricky.
Yeah, I don't. So there definitely is. There seems to be a pattern associated with ethnicities. There's no question to that. The question is it the ethnicity itself? And I think one of the questions that you asked, Henry, was, might there be an association with like sickle cell disease, right? Which is inherently connected to the African American community. But I think it makes a lot more sense to focus on the conditions and not on the ethnicity. So if somebody has a history of hypertension or diabetes that we know is associated with inferior outcomes and more severe cases, I think that absolutely should be considered. NBA players themselves are unlikely to be suffering from hypertension or diabetes. They're all pretty much or at least type 2 diabetes, they're all pretty much in very good physical athletic condition. But yes, I think certainly on the coaching side and the sports staff side, pre-existing conditions should be considered.
Or what about, I mean, I know that it's not fair to ask you all these questions, just you're the person we have available who knows about this stuff, but part of me is like, what if I have a medical condition that I don't want to disclose, right? What if I'm the head coach of some team and I have a complicated medical history and I want to decide if I'm going or not? I don't want to go tell my employer about it.
Honestly, like there are going to be cases like that. Even if whatever policy you put in place, there's not going to be 100% disclosure. So you have to count on that happening.
I think there's going to be we're gonna have some coaches, head or assistant, or executives that aren't there either for themselves or their wives or kids, because if they have a potential case with a family member, that means when they're done coaching, they have to separate from their family. And then they're saying, okay, when you're done, you still have to wait 2 more weeks before you go home to see them. They're just going to say, screw that, I'm going to stay home. Like we're going to see, you're not going to see 100% attendance.
Yeah. First of all, a lot of them should stay home, right?
Yeah.
And that makes this a lot safer. And if you're willing to do that and you're willing to draw the line and say, sorry, I know you own the team, but you're not invited. So I think that has to be done, unfortunately. But the truth is I think I don't know. It's in terms of period of time that you need before and after. I think that actually is something that could be compromised, right? If we're doing constant testing, and you really would have to make this work, right? We're going to have a very clear idea by the end of the playoffs, right? Where, if there's been any incidents, where that incidence has been. And I don't think you're going to need 2 weeks after.
I see what you're saying.
You could probably have 2 or 3 days after. You might even be able to get away with a shorter period ahead of time, although 2 weeks seems about as, getting close to that line. Maybe you could do a week and a half if you had a really good regime.
But all right, could you not do a test first before you get in the bubble? And if you're
Oh,
negative,
no, you have to.
right?
You would have to do both.
And how long do you have to wait if you're negative to start with? You still have to wait 2 weeks, thinking that maybe you got it, but it just wasn't enough to test positive, or can you test again after 4 days and 2 negatives in 4 days? You let them in the bubble.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in some ways, the best case scenario are the ones who test positive on the serology test, that test positive for the antibodies that have had it before, previously had symptoms, and now developed immunity. And they're the ones that you're quickest to let in, right? And the ones who have not had symptoms, right? You're going to have to be a lot more rigorous with them in terms of the testing. Yeah, I mean, the PCR testing is very good. It's a lot more accurate than the antibody testing. I think if you have a negative test, you would test them, right at the beginning or a couple days beforehand, and then you test them right when they arrive, and then you test them 2 or 3 times again throughout that isolation period. Actually, maybe more than that, maybe every 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
By the way, that would be another issue, that you have to have, players and staff that are willing to go through that type of testing regime.
Right.
I mean,
They're doing this all over the world, and now colleges are bringing their athletes back, and they're going to do the same thing. They're going to test them when they arrive. They can't bring them back till they know they have enough tests to test you on day one, and then you're quarantined until they get the results back, which Bilal just wrote, up to 5 days, which is what I'm hearing too with colleges. You might be quarantined for 5 days until they get those results back.
Well, in terms of availability of tests, that's where we've made the big breakthrough. So again, conflict of interest disclosure, but we've got 50,000 tests per week available now just through Tempus. So
wow, good.
We're making good progress there.
There are different kinds of tests, but in a nutshell, if I test negative on a Tuesday, how sure are you really that I'm not going to infect somebody in the future?
So what the PCR test for is for viral fragments. Okay. And so the question is how quickly you're producing those viral fragments. Now, the good news is that that's correlated with your infectivity. So if you're creating a lot of viral fragments in your saliva, or that are found in your blood, depending on what kind of testing they do, right? That's going to be correlated with how infective you are. But we know that there is an incubation period that is not insubstantial with this, where the viral fragments, there's certainly a window in which the test would come out negative, but you might just be at the beginning of ramping up in terms of catching the disease, and so there is a risk to missing that. And so, ideally, and from a cost perspective, it certainly would be worth it to the NBA. Ideally, you're testing every single day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We end the show traditionally, and we're getting close to that time, with Gerard, who is going to appear like he's in the first arrondissement of Paris, but is actually a fraud. Oh no, where's it? There he is. Okay.
I love it. Yes, the first arrondissement. That is where I am. Ari, this has been great. I actually have a larger question, not about the NBA, but about your work with natural language processing and machine learning.
Oh, wow.
That stuff actually works.
Ari knows about everything.
No, thank you. This is, yeah.
This is what you did at NSK, and I used to work for digital health startup companies, so I understand a lot of not to your level, but what they were doing. This is something that's been used in fields like the legal space, right? To study large amounts of data, figure out what lawyers need, don't need, all that. What are the challenges specifically, though, as it relates to healthcare and medicine? Because you can create new patterns, maybe in drug discovery or whatever, but you still need someone to look at that and be like, yeah, that's possible, versus a machine being like, have you thought about this? And it's like, no, that wouldn't work. What are the challenges with that?
So you actually got to the core of the issue of where we're seeing success in medicine and where we aren't. So machine learning is very good at replicating processes that we do very often as humans, and that's where it fails also, right? So if you train the machine learning model on a bunch of radiology images or radiology studies that had been labeled as positive or negative for a certain disease by radiologists, but the radiologist got a bunch of them wrong, The machine learning model is going to learn just to do it exactly like the way the radiologists do it. You know, these might be the expert radiologists, and so they might get it wrong less often. But that's how you train things. Now, where machine learning has been like the most magical, right, in the world of like, you know, where AlphaGo, right, are in areas where you can actually create simulation environments that replicate all of the details that you care about, right? And so a game is really easy to simulate.
These are kind learning environments, right? This is from David Epstein's book.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One would think, and I personally did think, that self-driving cars fell into that category, that you could simulate a lot of the physics. You know, we have really great driving games, video games. But it turns out that's not the case, that there's just so much that's really hard to model, like what you can actually see in a snowstorm, you know, the kind of capricious behaviors of pedestrians, things that are really hard to simulate, and that's made self-driving cars a lot more difficult. One of the thought experiments that I've had going through my head is that whether, you know, we actually create a really good NBA simulation. So right now, the NBA video games, you know, the 2K and NBA Live are not really good simulations, right? They're meant to look realistic, but in terms of how the players play, you know, like how they respond, they're not super realistic. But it might actually be possible to create a really good simulation of the NBA if you changed the way you modeled it. And so that was one of the areas that I thought could be an interesting way to experiment. And it affects the way we approach medicine also. So we recognize in medicine that some things, you know, you can actually train a model to do, and some things you can't. And drug discovery, Sharad, you know, one of the areas you mentioned, is one of the really difficult areas, because the actual underlying biology is very, very, very hard to do. So one of the big, you know, innovators in this area is a company called In Sitro, founded by a Stanford, you know, a pioneering machine learning scientist named Daphne Koller. And, you know, her insight was, we can't actually simulate it, but we can create, you know, this high throughput biology environment where we do pretty much every experiment that you could ever imagine and watch the results. So create a real life simulation of the biology, since we can't simulate the biology accurately within the computers.
So we are almost out of time. All right, can we do this again? I feel like we have 50 more things we want to talk about. Would that be okay?
I definitely have 50 more. Yeah, absolutely.
And in closing, I did get a private question from someone, which was, can you recommend some suggested reading on the topic of epidemiology?
So, you know, this is the trick of having gone through this from the academic perspective. You know, the stuff that I've read typically is really tough to get through boring textbooks and papers. You know, let me think about some more accessible recommendations, and I'll send them to you.
Okay, great. Or you can tweet it. We can retweet it, whatever you want.
All right, sure.
Fascinating stuff.
Wow.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm watching again right now. So
yeah.
Take your notes.
Awesome.
We didn't even get to the best part, which is Ari's doing all of these things while raising 5 children. Oh my gosh. Okay.
And competing with those 5 children for bandwidth. So
thank you for your precious bandwidth.
All right. Take care.